All right. Good morning. This is Chris Mark once again with a sniper's perspective. I appreciate everybody joining. Had a lot more viewers than I thought I would have for this ridiculous little podcast that I've been doing for a few weeks now. I certainly do appreciate everybody that's commented, giving me your 2 cents, and I'm going to do my best here. So today I'm going to talk about really kind of where my interest lies and what I do professionally. I'm an information security professional, risk management. I hate to use the word expert, but I think I can probably at this point in my career say expert. So I'm going to do that. And so we're going to talk Security 101, defining security and risk. This is going to be a very, very basic course, maybe a little bit deeper than you would expect, because there's a little more to defining security and risk than people may expect. So it should be interesting. I've got a lot of amusing anecdotes and certainly references, things like that. I've done this for a long time. And so we're going to do that. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Now, with that being said, sorry guys, trying to get the right look here for everybody. With that being said, let me first talk a little bit about my background. Now, this picture you're seeing here on the right, that's actually me. I was doing some contracting probably about 10 or 12 years ago. I got a little bit burned out on information security, decided to go back to my roots carrying a gun. This is back when Captain Phillips and that whole thing, the pirates were in Somalia. So got in shape a little bit, went back to contracting for a while, made a few bucks, and it was tons of fun. The reason I'm showing you that is, I don't know a lot of things in this world. I know security. I've done security my entire career. I've gotten over 30 years of experience in security, everything from physical to operational. So let me just go over my bio just a little bit. I'm not going to belabor this too much, but because we're going to talk about some esoteric concepts and things, I don't want you to think I'm making this up. So I'm actually an information assurance cybersecurity doctoral, what's called an ABD. If you heard my last presentation on risk, we call it all but done or all but dissertation. I was about halfway through my dissertation when a little thing called divorce came calling. Hopefully I can finish that at some point, but right now I'm not quite a PhD. I was one of the original authors of the global credit card security standard used worldwide. I've worked for Visa, MasterCard, PCI SSC, AT&T, Exodus Communications. I've owned 3 companies. I've trained about 10,000 people worldwide on security. I've consulted with 150 major corporations, probably the biggest ones you can imagine, published over 60 articles. I've been on Fox News, CNN, NPR, former Force Recon Marine, Navy officer, scout sniper, combat veteran. I've spoken at, I think at last count, about 65 different events over the years. Published dozens of articles. You can see Counter-Terrorist Magazine, Transaction World, Secure Computing. So again, I don't know a lot of things. What I do know, however, is I know security and risk management. I love the topic. I'm a huge security nerd, and I love talking about it. And I've done it for a heck of a long time. So before we get into this, and again, I warned you this is going to be academic. It's going to be a little bit nerdy. So the first question we ask ourselves, because we're going to define security, is why in the heck do we even need definitions? Why are definitions important to us? Have you ever thought about that? Until I started really researching this, I never really thought about why would we need definitions. Well, there's a few reasons, right? First, they provide clarity to the reader or audience, right? Second, they enable 2 or more people to have a common understanding of a word. And then they allow for measurement and evaluation. Here are some just very basic examples, right? If I were to say in a football game, the play moved the ball 1 yard. How far is a yard? Well, we all understand that a yard is 3 feet. So by having a definition of a yard and having a common understanding, we can say, aha, he moved 5 yards. That's 15 feet. We also understand things like that. My friend owes me $2. Well, how much is $2? Well, $2 is 200 pennies. It's 20 dimes. So it may sound simplistic, but definitions really allow us to have a common understanding and allow us to speak. And anybody that's ever gone to a foreign country and you can't speak the language, it's because we don't understand their language. We don't have those definitions. And that's really important. And if you've ever been in a lawsuit, which I have, business lawsuits, and you start talking to attorneys, you realize they have their own language. Security practitioners have their own. Just about every industry has their own kind of lingo and things like that. And it takes a while to understand. So definitions are important for us to understand each other. Within security and risk management, it's absolutely critical that we have a common understanding. So now we're going to talk about something really interesting. The odd story of the Oxford English Dictionary, the first real dictionary or attempt at creating a dictionary. So in 1857, the Philological Society of London, yes, the Philological Society of London, they called for a new English dictionary. They said that the existing dictionaries were incomplete and deficient. And they said, hey, we need to have a dictionary, so let's figure it out. In 1879, they made an agreement with Oxford University Press and a guy named James Murray to create a new dictionary. They said it was going to be 4 volumes, and they planned on it being 6,400 pages. And they thought, in 10 years, we can have this thing done, and it will be done. Well, guess what? In 5 years, by 1884, they had only gotten to the word ant, A-N-T. That was it. So they said, okay, we've got to figure out a better way to do this. So the Oxford English Dictionary Society went out and said, let's figure out a better way to do this. So what they did is they started putting ads in papers, and they started saying, look, if you've got an old Bible laying around the house, or you've got old letters from people, and there's a reference to a word in there, if you can fill out this form and you can say, hey, here's the way this word was used in context and whatever, send it to us. And we've got people that will sit down and we will define the word and put it in the dictionary. And so it was really cool. So by 2009, Web 2.0 was the 1 millionth word in the dictionary. A new English word, or what they call a neologism, is coined every 98 minutes. A new English word is coined every 98 minutes, if you can believe that. So pretty cool story, but here's where it gets even cooler. Wait till you hear this story. William Chester Minor. If you get a chance, there's a great book, and there was a movie made out of it with Mel Gibson called The Professor and the Madman by Simon Winchester. I love the book. He was an American Army surgeon during the U.S. Civil War. He was sent to a psychiatric hospital in 1872. He'd walked in, thought his wife was having an affair on him. He had a lot of psychiatric issues from being a surgeon in the war, and he shot his wife and killed her. So he got sent to a psychiatric hospital in London. Well, all of a sudden, the Oxford English Dictionary started getting word after word after word, and these things were really, really detail-oriented, and they were researched perfectly. And they're like, holy cow, who is this guy? So they went out to go find out who he was. Well, it turns out this guy was in a psychiatric hospital. That single guy, William Chester Minor, contributed over 10,000 words to the Oxford English Dictionary. No kidding. If you get a chance, check out the book, The Professor and the Madman by Simon Winchester, or the movie's great as well. Again, Mel Gibson's in it. I thought the book was a little bit better, but the story is fantastic. So again, why do we need that? Alan Moore, philosopher, he says, language comes first. It's not that language grows out of consciousness. If you haven't got language, you can't be conscious. Charles Sanders Peirce, the definition of definition is at bottom just what the maxim of pragmatism expresses. And then one of my favorite security theorists, security practitioners, a guy by the name of Dr. Giovanni Minuta. I've never met him, but I've done a lot of reading on his writings. He's an Italian former Army officer, and he does a lot. And he says, in the absence of agreed upon definitions, the concept of security means different things to different people in different contexts. He's 100% right. And that creates a challenge when we're trying to figure out how to secure an environment, whether it's a corporate environment or a military base or whatever. If we're not speaking a common language, we can't say whether or not something is or is not secure. And we're going to talk a little bit about that here in just a second. It's pretty fascinating. So, word of warning. Definitions may not be universally accepted, especially when you get into things like security. So, for example, the NSA, NIST, DHS, all have differing definitions of various security-related terms. Adversary, as an example, is listed in the DHS lexicon, but not in the CERT glossary of terms. Definitions may vary depending upon the organization or location, and that's okay. We're going to talk about how you get around that and how you can still work within those constraints. So there is a word of warning. It would be nice if there was a common definition for every single word in security. Keep in mind that information security, the industry itself, is still relatively new. When I came in here about 23, 24 years ago, it was still pretty new. I mean, we did not have the internet really until about 1999, did we? So it's still pretty new. A lot of these things are still being ironed out, but we're going to talk about how to get around that. It's not that big of a deal. So any Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure fans out there probably remembers they talk about what they call Socrates, Socrates. So Socrates actually is pretty fascinating, and he talks about definitions. So he was debating about 2,300 years ago. He was debating with somebody, and they were talking about what we now call the priority of definition. They were debating virtues, okay, things that are very, very difficult to define, things like generosity, charity, beauty, virtues. And he came up with what we now call the question of F-ness. Okay. And the question of F-ness, and essentially what he said is if you don't know what F, the variable F is, then you can't know if something is or is not F. So if you don't know, for example, if you can't define beauty, you can't know whether or not something is not beautiful. You can't describe the characteristics of beauty or F-ness, and you can't tell someone how to achieve that which is not defined, F-ness. So the priority of definition is the definition is here is an epistemological principle asserting that a person must first know the definition of a property before the person can know anything else about that property. And again, Socrates, translated into English, we call it the question of F-ness, which basically says, look, without a definition, you simply cannot say whether or not something is or is not that which is not defined. And you can't even describe the characteristics of that or how to achieve that which is not defined. It's called the question of F-ness. That's how important it is to have a definition for anything, but much less security. So let's talk a little bit about denotative and connotative definitions. And again, I told you I was going to get a little bit geeky here. That's my education, my PhD level education here, taking you guys back to junior high school level language arts. So denotations, these are objective dictionary definitions of word, objective accepted dictionaries. A great example of that, house. If I say house, you can picture in your mind what a house is. Okay, very, very simple. Connotation is a subjective and personal definition of a word that has emotional and cultural implications. If I were to say home, well, you may say a home is where the heart is. A home is where my family lives. A home is where I lay my head. A home is where my dogs are, my pets are. A home is where my childhood was spent. So a home is distinctly different than a house generally. You may say, well, my house is my home. But if I say a house is an object. It's got a very specific definition, dictionary definition. A home is going to have a very specific personal connotation, subjective connotation to it. And that's where it's important to remember when we start talking about things, it's important that we have a specific denotation. There are other types of definitions as well. We have denotation, connotation. We have a term of art, for example, and these you'll find in specific industries. We have, for example, you can say, dummy. That would be a colloquialism. Like consider the word dope. Okay, denotation: any thick, liquid, or pasty preparation as a lubricant used in preparing a surface. A connotation could be illicit drugs. A term of art, dope, believe it or not, is a setting on a rifle scope. We use that all the time when we're talking as snipers. We say, "What's the dope on your rifle?" A colloquialism: well, a dope could reference a slow person. Lingo could mean cool. That's probably for you younger people that may be listening. That's probably an archaic reference, but anyway, that person's dope. Yes, I just dated myself with that, so don't judge me on that. So again, denotative connotations, connotative definitions, and then we've got terms of art, colloquialisms, and lingo. Again, let's just spend a little bit of time on this. We're not going to beat up on it too much, but it is important to understand a little bit of the difference. So lingo is an informal term for the special vocabulary of a particular group or field. Kids, teenagers absolutely use lingo. I remember we used to do that all the time. Even as you get older, if anybody spends time in the military, for goodness sakes, we have more lingo than you can shake a stick at. Information security. I always find it interesting. My wife works in the oil and gas industry, and I listen to her speak with her coworkers. I swear I probably understand about 15% of what they're saying at times. They're talking upstream, downstream. They're talking all kinds of stuff I don't understand because they've got their own informal terms for things. The credit card industry that I worked in for many, many years, boy, the lingo out there, it is difficult to understand what they're talking about. Colloquialisms. These are informational words or phrases used in everyday speech, often varies by geography or demographic. Examples. I live here in Houston. If you ever go to Texas A&M, walk on campus, you'll hear every single student out there. They don't say hello, they say howdy. If you go to Auburn, they'll say hey. If you go to Australia, good day, mate, right? If you go to England, they'll call you a mate for a friend. They'll say, yeah, my mate did this, my mate did that. Those are called colloquialisms. They all have similar meanings, but they're different words for similar meanings. And then, of course, we have terms of art. These are a word or a phrase that has a precise, specialized meaning within a particular field or expression. Again, if you go to the legal field, you're going to hear burden of proof, very specific definition within the legal. If you're a sailor, windward, very specific definition. Then within mathematics, algorithm, attack surface, very specific definition within cybersecurity. So these are just different types of, again, words that we use in definitions. Okay, now here's where we get a little bit theoretical, and this is important because when we start talking about things like security, you're going to understand why this is important. So we're going to go back to the 2nd century Common Era. There's a Christian apologist named Athenagoras of Athens, and he promoted something called the Apathetic Theology. In essence, what that meant was there was this belief that God was so omnipotent that it was not possible to describe God in positive terms. So, for example, God was so omnipotent, so omniscient, you could not say God is loving. It just did not capture everything that God was. So you could only describe God by what God is not. God is not jealous. God is not hateful. God does not make mistakes. Everything else is God, right? But God, we know, does not make mistakes. That's called apophatic theology. And we call it apophasis, the practice of describing something by stating which characteristics it does not have, especially because human thought or language is believed to be inefficient or insufficient to describe it fully or accurately. So apophasis. And you're saying, well, what in the heck does this have to do with security, Chris? And we're going to talk about why it is important. And it really does come about, and it's stung me. I've worked in the last 24 years. I have either been directly involved in or have analyzed in my various jobs within the credit card industry, probably about 2,000 data breaches. And again, I've been on site after major data breaches, and I've talked to thousands of people, security professionals, and asked them what happened. And I've done a heck of a lot of security assessments to see where people stand on security. And it's always interesting to me when you ask somebody and say, do you feel like the company was secure or they weren't secure? And the answers you get. And that's why I started doing research on this. So it's called apophatic theology. So here's a great example of where apophasis comes in. So Jacob Ellis v. Ohio in 1984. So there was a French movie that came out. It was called The Lovers. And there was a lawsuit. And this is back when, I'm sorry, 1964. It should say 1964. I made a mistake here. It's actually 1964. So pornography in the United States used to be illegal, hardcore pornography. And so there was a Supreme Court case over a French movie that was released in the United States over, I'm doing my best French here, which I'm not good at that. Les Amants, I think is the way it's pronounced. But there was a lawsuit called Jacob Ellis v. Ohio where they were saying this is not a pornographic movie. And so it was actually Justice Stewart, who's a Supreme Court justice, who wrote the opinion. And here's what he said. And it's really kind of fascinating, but it applies to what we were just talking about with apophasis and, of course, to defining security. He said, I shall not today attempt further to define the kinds of material I understand to be embraced within that shorthand description, hardcore pornography, and perhaps I could never succeed in intelligibly doing so. But I know it when I see it, and the motion picture involved in this case is not that. So let me read that again because it is important. I shall not today attempt further to define the kinds of material I understand to be embraced within that shorthand description, hardcore pornography, and perhaps I could never succeed in intelligibly doing so, but I know it when I see it, and the motion picture involved in this case is not that. So what he's saying is I don't have the ability to define hardcore pornography here, and perhaps I could never do it, but I know it when I see it, and that's not it. So whatever hardcore pornography is, this movie ain't it. Okay, so that really is an example of applying apophasis and saying, I don't know what it is, but I know what it's not. Now, this does create issues for us when we get in a situation where there's liability on things, right? Because I'm not a Supreme Court justice. I'm a security practitioner, and companies want to ask me and say, Chris, is my company secure or is it not secure? And this is where it can get us into some trouble and why we're going to try to define it. So how does this apply to security? Well, quite frankly, security professionals today, we're challenged big time because we'll go in there and you'll go in there and companies will say, Hey, Chris, I just spent, $5 million. Is my company secure or is it not secure? And you have to give them some kind of an answer. Now, let me be very clear on this, and people can debate me all they want. Security is not a binary proposition. There is no such thing as you are secure or you are not secure. Okay. Now, security professionals today are challenged to tell clients they are appropriately secure. Notice the qualifier, they're appropriately secure. I would argue this is caused by a lack of understanding and agreement upon the definition of security. I have gone out during my PhD studies and I've asked over 200 security practitioners, everybody from law enforcement to maritime security to physical security to cybersecurity professionals. I said, please write down a definition. It was a blind survey. I said, write down a definition of security. Out of 200 practitioners, I got over 50 different definitions of security, a simple term, 50 different definitions. So how can we, going back to, again, that question of F-ness, how can we make a statement as to whether or not something is or is not secure if we can't even agree upon a definition? We can't describe what it is or is not. So I cannot define what security is through its attributes, but I can define what it's not. I've heard this a lot. After a data breach, security practitioners, politicians, everybody's very quick to say, well, I couldn't tell you you were secure, but I can tell you now you weren't. And you say, well, how do you know that? Well, because if you were secure, you would not have been breached. And the very fact that you got breached means you weren't secure. Again, apophasis. That's an absolutely fundamentally flawed way of thinking. Security professionals are hard pressed to tell a company when they're secure, but very, very quick to tell them, oh, you weren't secure because you got breached. And they'll say, I can't tell you what security is, but I can tell you what it's not. And it ain't you, once again, after the fact, after you got breached. Well, that doesn't help companies. What companies need is they need somebody to be able to come in and say, hey, am I secure? Now they'll ask that because you're the expert, right? If you're a security practitioner, you're the expert. So I'll walk in and say, well, I'm not going to tell you whether or not you are or aren't secure. What I'm going to say is, and again, we're going to talk about this in a later course, but I'll say, well, let's see what your risk analysis says based upon the identified risks facing your organization. Do you have the appropriate controls to mitigate those identified risks? If so, then we can say you are appropriately secure. Does that mean you're not going to get breached? Absolutely, that doesn't mean you're not going to get breached. What that means is you have implemented risk commensurate with the identified risks. Okay. Now, as we talked about earlier, organizations will create their own definitions. And we'll talk about whether or not this is a problem. You've got Department of Homeland Security Risk Lexicon. You've got the National Security Archive Cyber Glossary, SANS Institute Glossary of Security Terms, ISC Squared, NIST, Skillsoft, NICCS, CERT, ISACA, CDSE. The list goes on. AT&T's got their own. Everybody's got their own. So which one is correct? They all are. And it's contingent upon the agency with which you're working, right? I mean, if a company needs to comply with something for the DHS, clearly you're going to use the definitions from the DHS risk lexicon, right? If you're going to assess somebody against the SANS standard or whatever the case is, you're going to use that. But what they try to do, the reason that we have so many different lexicons and definitions is because they're trying to create a common language for their stakeholders, So what I like to tell organizations, I go, look, if you want to adopt the DHS risk lexicon, that's great. Do that. If you want to adopt the SANS, if you want to write your own, that's fine as well. As long as your stakeholders are working from a common accepted set of definitions where you say, here is how we define exploit. Here's how we define security breach. Here's how we define vulnerability. Here's how we define. As long as everybody's working from the same sheet of music, you have something that you can then manage towards. So again, they're all accurate. You just want to make sure all the appropriate stakeholders are working from the same sheet of music. So now let's talk about a working definition of security and risk. And notice I put security/risk because they're inextricably entwined. You simply cannot talk about security without risk. You can talk about risk without security. They are mutually independent in that capacity, but security is not mutually independent from risk. And we're going to talk about this in a later course. We'll get much, much deeper into it. So security, notice the qualifiers. I'm very careful about this for a reason, okay? Security, again, it is contextual. If we're talking about personal security, if we're talking about security of something else, we may flex that a little bit. Within the context of information security or physical security, I would say security can be defined as, and this is in quotes, the implementation of controls commensurate with the identified risks. And if you'll notice, I've got controls and identified highlighted in green for a reason. Okay. Controls can be identified as, in quotes, people, processes, and or technologies implemented to mitigate a specific identified risk. Again, you notice that I am qualifying saying identified risks. The reason for that is there are always unidentified risks out there, okay? You're going to have de minimis risk. You're going to have risks you simply don't know about. There are zero-day exploits that are being discovered right now we don't even know exist. So the only thing you can do is try to implement controls commensurate with the identified risk. Does that mean that you're going to swing and miss on some? Make no mistake, you absolutely are. There are going to be threats out there. There are going to be risks that you don't even know exist. If you're familiar with the Johari window, you've got the known knowns, you've got the known unknowns, you've got the unknown knowns, and you've got the unknown unknowns. You're absolutely going to have risks out there you don't know about. So the best you can do is implement controls commensurate with the identified risk. So again, security can be defined as the implementation of controls commensurate with the identified risk. Now we're going to have to talk about what risk is here in a little bit, okay? So risk is an artificial, whoops, sorry about that. Risk is an artificial construct. So what does that mean? Well, risk doesn't exist in nature. Biology is not an artificial construct. Biology is biology, okay? Animals, every living organism has cells. That is biology. We can describe that. Risk, like math, is something that we use to describe the world around us. So it is an artificial construct. It is something that we have created, a model we have created to describe the world around us. Risk may be expressed as the likelihood of an adverse action occurring and the impact should it occur. So there are two components to risk in this context. And notice that I say it may be expressed. If we talk about risk in a different context, for example, there's a financial risk. If you were to talk about insurance and actuarial scientists, they'll have a little different definition of risk. If you were to talk about financial analysts, their definition of risk may be a little bit different. If you talk about economists, it may be a little bit different. In the context of security, I'm saying it may be expressed as a likelihood of an adverse action occurring, something you don't want to have happen, a bad thing happening, the likelihood of that, okay, the probability that a bad thing will happen, and the impact should it occur. Now, that impact can be either qualified or it can be quantified. Great example here. Let's say you own a $100,000 house. We talked about this before, $100,000 house, and there is a 1% chance it will burn completely to the ground every single year. 1% chance. It's not going to burn halfway down, just for the sake of argument. And if you're an actuarial scientist, please don't beat me up on this. I understand your job is much, much more complex. So let's say you've got a $100,000 house. Every year you've got a 1% chance it will burn completely to the ground. So that means you have an annualized loss expectancy, an ALE, of 100,000 times 1%, or $1,000 a year of annualized loss expectancy. So your insurance company will come to you and say, we expect you to pay $1,000 a year plus a little bit of a premium. So, we cover our costs for administrivia and stuff like that. So that's kind of how insurance works. So you've got the probability, 1% chance of something happening you don't want to have happen, your house burning to the ground. The impact, in this case, $100,000 of impact. So it's expressed as the likelihood and the impact. In this case, we quantified it, annualized loss expectancy, $1,000 per year. Obviously, it gets more complex. As we get into further discussions, we're going to show you how to do some really neat things with risk, but that's the way to look at it. Okay, so we talk about risk in that capacity. If you saw my last presentation on risk, risk is really one of those fascinating things. We use it every day and people don't think about it. And there's something called probability neglect. People will look at really horrible things and they'll neglect the probability of it happening. And one of the examples I brought up is shark attacks. The thought of being attacked and eaten by a shark is so horrible to most people that after Jaws came out, the movie Jaws, 25 years later, 46% of people that saw Jaws 25 years later were still afraid to go in the ocean. 46% of people 25 years later were still afraid to go in the ocean. Now, if you're unaware, the likelihood of being bitten by a shark is 1 in 3.7 million. 1 in 3.7 million. The likelihood of being bitten by a shark is 1 in 3.7 million. My wife actually did get bitten by a shark. It was a small shark, but it actually did bite her on the hip when she was a kid. She had to get stitches and stuff like that. But it's 1 in 3.7 million. It is exceedingly, exceedingly rare. To give you an example, the 1 in a million probability is if you were to flip a coin right now and it would come up heads 20 times in a row. That's a 1 in a million probability. Of the next 24 babies born in the world, one of them will end up being president of the United States. That's a 1 in a million probability. So the chance of being bitten by a shark is exceedingly rare, but people are terrified of it. Why? Because the idea of being bitten by a shark is terrifying. And here's what's also funny. We talk about ignoring probability. When the lottery comes out, we play the Powerball here in Texas. It gets close to $1 billion. It just hit 900 and some odd million a couple of weeks ago. Everybody wants to play it. Your likelihood of winning that Powerball, I looked it up and I actually posted it on my last podcast, 392 billion with a B to 1. 392 billion to 1. 392 billion to 1 or something like that. There are only 350 million people in the United States. Okay, so it is exceedingly rare, but boy, when it gets up to 900 million bucks, everybody's playing. Now, here's what's really fascinating about that. My podcast, I know everybody's probably thinking I'm the next Joe Rogan, and I probably, I'm a wealthy guy from it, but believe it or not, it's not. $1 million would, probably help me quite a bit right now, but I won't play the lottery when it's $1 million, but when it hits a 900 million, now I'm out there playing, because that's, $1 million. That's not really going to help me. It's just a really interesting concept that people, we tend to ignore probabilities. The impact of something increases. So here's some important points about security and risk. As we talked about before, security is predicated upon understanding and evaluating risk. You simply cannot make a statement about security without understanding risk. It is impossible. It is absolutely impossible. As I said, security is not a binary proposition. You cannot say, my house is secure. Let me give you a good example of that, okay? If you were to come to me right now and say, Chris, is your house secure? And if I were to say, yes, it is, that would be a flawed assumption. What I could say is, given the identified risks, I believe I've implemented controls commensurate with those risks. And you would say, okay, explain that to me. I'd say, well, I don't have any kids in the house right now. My wife is here with me. My dogs are here. Don't really have, we've got cars outside. I've got cameras up. I've got this, that, and everything else. So I believe I've got appropriate controls for the risks that I see facing my house. And you say, okay, hey, we're going to drop the Hope Diamond off at your house tonight for a couple of days. Is that cool? And I go, sure. Now, once you bring the Hope Diamond into my house, are those controls that I have in place right now commensurate with the increased risk? Absolutely, they're not. So once that risk increases, in this case, the impact should that Hope Diamond get stolen, plus the likelihood if somebody knows about it, the probability of somebody trying to steal it goes up. So the risk goes up. Therefore, the controls have to increase commensurate with that risk. If they're not commensurate with the risk, then my house is not appropriately secure. So security is predicated upon understanding risk and having controls commensurate with the risk. So it's not a binary proposition. You cannot say is and is not secure. You can only say you have adequate security. It has mitigated the identified risks. As you identify new risks, your security has to change. And that is why you're going to hear me over and over and over. And I write on this extensively. I write on risk a lot. The number one thing I think where companies kind of lose sight of is they'll come to security professionals, big companies, and they'll say, hey, I've got a pile of money. I want a firewall. I want an IDS. I want this, that, and all this. And they want to buy toys. They want to buy technology. And hey, technology is important in today's world. But the mundane stuff, the boring stuff, the risk analysis, the policies and procedures, all that kind of stuff that really affect your security, they tend to leave that by the wayside. And I'm like, guys, that is security. Security is not technology. Security is staying awake. And I'll give you an example from my own life. One of the things that frustrates me a bit about information security at times is a vast majority of practitioners don't come from a physical security world. And I can tell you, having done, been in combat and done Overwatch and done physical security, military installations, and having done anti-piracy and stuff, when you see somebody pointing an RPG at you, you have a very visceral response to that, right? And you understand I better do my job correctly. I better make sure I stay awake. I better make sure I walk my post correctly. I better make sure that we're following our policies and procedures, because a failure to do that has very real consequences. It's not somebody stealing data. It could result in, harm, injury, and potentially death to your friends, coworkers, whomever. So you have a very visceral response to that. And so when you look at what security really entails, it is about ensuring consistent, repeatable applications of policies and procedures to identify and mitigate the identified risks. And that's what it takes. And that is the mundane, boring, really painful side of security. It's much easier to say, hey, I've got a pile of money. Can you just give me some new cool toys? And that'll take care of it. It doesn't happen. If you've got a firewall with somebody that doesn't know how to configure it correctly, you don't have a firewall, you've got a router, right? You've got to have somebody that knows how to configure it correctly. And now I'll get off my high horse on that. That's for another day. So the security risk balance, and again, this is kind of a simplistic example here, but as you can see, as the risks increase, the controls have to increase. So you always want the controls to at least balance out with the risks, if not exceed the risks. Hey, there's nothing wrong if you've got more controls and you've got risks. There's nothing wrong with that. If you've got more risks than you have controls, now you're putting yourself at risk, right? Now you've got some gaps that somebody can exploit to get in there. And that's the hard part, is figuring out where are those risks. And that does require a risk analysis. Once you have that risk analysis, you can come down and say, okay, here's what we really need to do. Now, here's where it gets fascinating. When you do that risk analysis, you want to address the greatest risks first. You're always going to have the long tail of de minimis risks that continue. Believe it or not, about every 7 years, and again, I'm a risk nerd and a probability nerd, and I love doing this. About 7 years, every 7 years, somewhere in the world, somebody is hit by a meteorite. Believe it or not. Now, that doesn't mean a big giant meteorite comes through and crushes somebody's car, but there was a kid hit in Florida about 10 years ago. He was walking with his dad in his driveway. It hit him in the arm. He had to get a couple of stitches, but it left a divot in their driveway. There was a guy in India hit, I think, about 5 or 6 years ago. There was a woman on her couch in Sylacauga, Alabama. Meteorite came through the ceiling, landed next to her on the couch, and blew a big hole in the couch. It does happen, believe it or not, about every 7 years. Now, knowing that, are you going to go out and buy a titanium helmet to walk around so you don't get hit by a meteorite? You could, but I would suggest that's probably not a good use of your, scarce security funds and risk mitigation funds. I'd probably recommend that when you get in your car, you put your seatbelt on, you make sure your tires are inflated correctly, make sure your doors are locked at night. Take those steps first, mitigate the greatest risk first, and then you can start looking at that long tail de minimis risk. I call it slicing the pie. Everybody, every organization, even the US government, has a finite pool of resources to address literally infinite risks, right? And so what you want to do is you want to slice that pie up appropriately so you can address as many risks as you can. And you know what? Some of those risks you're just going to have to accept and say, you know what? Is there a chance a meteorite's going to come crashing through the ceiling? Yeah. But you know what? That's a de minimis risk. There's no way to predict it. It's if you've never read the book by Nassim Taleb, The Black Swan, that's kind of a black swan event. If it happens, it's a pretty darn bad day for you. But is that worth buying $1 million titanium shell over the building? Probably not. So we don't worry about that. But that's the security risk balance that you should be focused on. So in summary, definitions, yeah, they're absolutely critical to ensuring a common understanding among stakeholders. And definitions are important for everything we do. Certainly anybody that's married, I'm going to make a joke about this. My wife's probably going to listen to this and want to have a discussion about definitions. But anybody that's married has probably found themselves, especially early on in their marriage, probably finding themselves realizing they don't always have the same definition as their wife. For example, when she says, "I'd appreciate it if you wash the dishes," well, I thought I washed the dishes appropriately, and apparently we had a different definition of what clean meant. So I have since learned. Definitions can be found in various standards within various groups, but we have developed a working definition. As I said before, security can be defined as the implementation of controls commensurate with identified risks. Now, just so you know, that the next one of these I'm going to do is actually going to be talking about risk. I love risk. I love risk. Love risk. Then we're going to get into the characteristics of security and some other really cool stuff. Controls are identified as people and or processes and or technologies that mitigate a particular identified risk. Don't forget processes, okay? Processes and policies go hand in hand, okay? Consistent, repeatable processes have to have policies to ensure that it says this door will always be locked between working hours. And then you have to have a mechanism to ensure it is always locked. It is audited to ensure it's always locked, and that you've got processes to enforce that it's always locked. And we'll talk about that again. But processes are important, and oftentimes they're forgotten about. Risk is inextricably entwined with security. It is not possible to measure security without an understanding the risks facing the organization. It's just not. Without that, you simply you don't know. If you walk into my house and you don't know what I've got in here, whether I've got the Hope Diamond, whether I've got gold bars, whether I've got, whatever, a daycare in the back room, you simply don't know what the risks are. So you cannot make a statement about whether or not I've got appropriate security or other controls in place, right? Think about it. I mean, if I've got a daycare, you would want to make sure that I've got appropriate alarms in place, locks on doors, fire suppression systems, all these things. So it extends simply beyond security. But without analyzing the risks, you can't even make a statement about any of those controls. Risk can be expressed as a function of the likelihood of an adverse action and the impact should it occur. Again, using that house example, $100,000 house, 1% chance it burns down every year, annualized loss expectancy of $1,000. And finally, security is not a binary proposition. As risks increase, controls have to increase relative to the identified risks, or the security is effectively reduced. And we see this happen all the time, right? I just wrote an article that should be getting published here in a couple of weeks, and it talks about the security and resource function. The resource and time function of security. Great book, or a great book and a great movie, Shawshank Redemption. So if you remember Andy Dufresne, he's in a prison. Now that prison has certain controls to keep prisoners in there because they're considered dangerous. We don't want them in society. They're paying their dues, all that kind of stuff. They've got very thick walls. They've got bars. They've got guards walking around that are armed. They act as a deterrence, an active and a passive deterrence. Andy Dufresne's in there. What's he got? He's got a tiny little rock hammer. He's got time. So he sits there with that rock hammer over years and years and years, and he manages to escape. So when you look at security, any security mechanism will degrade over time as resources increase, technology increases. It will degrade. Good example, when the data encryption standard was invented by IBM in 1977, it was considered uncrackable. By 1999, it was being brute forced in 24 hours. By 2017, it was taking less than 23 seconds to brute force it. Today, it's considered completely fallible. So again, all security mechanisms, all security implementations will degrade over time. So it's a constant evolution of risk analysis and security implementation. Risk analysis, security implementation. So as we talked about today, a quick definition, well, not that quick, almost 43 minutes of defining security. Hopefully everybody found this a little bit interesting. As you can tell, I'm a nerd. I really get a kick out of talking about security and risk. As you can see, I got a new green screen in the back, so it looks like I'm in a command center and tries to make me look even a little bit smarter than I probably am. But really appreciate everybody listening. And once again, love the fact that people are paying attention to my podcast. And thank you so much. And we'll have another one coming up here before too long. Thanks, everyone.